Hey everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. Today we're looking at Nahida and if it's actually worth rolling for her. There are a few things that we tend to look at when judging how good a character is. 1. What role do they fill? 2. How good do they fill that role? And 3. Is there anyone who does that role as good as them, or even better than them? So let's just get started. The first thing to figure out is just what role does Nahida fill. To do so, let's take a quick look at her kit. Her normal attack is just a standard catalyst, normal, charge, etc. attacks, so I'm not going to talk about that. Her skill, All Schemes to Know, however, is quite interesting. It has both a tap and a held version, but both fundamentally do the same thing. On usage, Nahida marks up to 8 enemies with the Seed of Skanda, linking each enemy to each other. When you trigger any elemental reaction on a marked enemy, all marked enemies up to a certain distance will take additional dendro damage based on Nahida's attack and elemental mastery. This damage can only occur once per 2.5 seconds per enemy though. Assuming a maxed out Nahida, this attack does 185.76% attack and 371.52% elemental mastery to each marked enemy every 2.5 seconds basically. On top of this already powerful off-field damage, this skill is even stronger than it first appears because every instance of damage dealt by this skill is unbounded by internal cooldowns. To those of you who don't know what internal cooldowns are, the short version is, every element applying ability in the game is typically bounded by both time and number of hits. Most abilities can only apply an elemental aura to an enemy once every 3 hits, or after 2.5 seconds have passed, whichever comes to pass first. Given that Nahida's skill only applies once every 2.5 seconds though, you might be thinking to yourself, that's kinda useless. And you'd be right if not for Nahida's burst. Nahida's burst, Illusory Heart, is quite interesting in that it doesn't do any damage at all, nor does it heal anyone. Instead, when this ability is used, Nahida summons the Shrine of Maya, which is a lasting circular AoE that provides multiple buffs depending on your party composition. If you have a Pyro character in your team, Nahida's off-field skill damage is increased. If you have a Hydro character in your team, the duration of Nahida's burst increases. And finally, and probably most importantly, if you have an Electro character in your team, the interval between Nahida's off-field dendro damage is decreased. If you have additional characters of those elements in your team, the various buffs given are increased as well, though it does cap out at 2 characters per element. Now, looking at this nifty table from Honey Hunter, we see that the damage increase at level 10 from one Pyro character is 26.78% and 40.18% for 2 Pyro characters. That is a decent amount of free damage, but it's likely this value stacks with all the other damage bonus values, so not that groundbreaking. For one Electro character, you can get up to 0.45 seconds off Nahida's skill interval and 0.67 seconds with 2 Electro characters. This means that Nahida's skill will hit once every 1.83 seconds if you have 2 Electro characters. Finally, for one Hydro character, Nahida's burst will last 6.02 seconds longer and 9.03 seconds longer with 2 Hydro characters. This is honestly the weakest buff that can be applied because Nahida's burst already lasts for 15 seconds with a 13.5 second cooldown. On top of that, the burst only costs 50 energy. Granted, with the scalings on Nahida's skill, you're probably building as much elemental mastery on her as possible, so having a longer lasting burst isn't a bad thing since it allows you to min-max even more towards elemental mastery rather than having to sacrifice some for energy recharge. But that's it for Nahida's burst. Nahida's passives are all quite good. Her passive 1, Compassion Illuminated, increases the active character's elemental mastery by 25% of the party member with the highest elemental mastery when the active character is within the AoE of Nahida's burst. This elemental mastery bonus is capped at 250, but 1000 elemental mastery is already pretty high and somewhat near optimization, so you shouldn't worry too much about it. You can get higher than 1000, it is possible, but it requires a lot of optimizations. Her passive 2, Awakening Elucidated, increases Nahida's Tri-Karma Purifications, that off-field dendro damage attached to her skill, that damage and crit rate by 0.1% and 0.03% respectively per point of elemental mastery she has above 200. So, based on all of Nahida's abilities, it's pretty plain to see that Nahida is a sub-DPS or off-field DPS unit in the same vein as characters like Fischl or Beto. So now we have to look at how well does Nahida do in this role as sub-DPS. Luckily, this should be pretty easy. If we assume 100% burst uptime for Nahida, which isn't a stretch in the slightest, all we have to do is calculate the damage dealt by Nahida while off-field and compare it to a standard off-field DPS character like Fischl. Now, I say that, but the problem is Nahida's off-field damage is difficult to quantify. Kind of. Her off-field damage is contingent on elemental reactions being performed on enemies that are marked by her skill. While under her burst effect, Nahida can physically hit up to once every 1.83 seconds, but that requires you to be reacting every 1.83 seconds. Is this possible? Yes, it's actually quite easy, especially with Pyro and Burning as a reaction, but is this the standard for every team comp? Absolutely not. However, there is still a very easy way to at least compare Nahida's damage to other characters. Let us assume that both Nahida and our comparison character, Fischl, are off-field with our team hitting X Quicken applications per second, Quicken being the reaction between Electron and Dendro, to help even the playing field between Fischl and Nahida. Let us then set X to be 1 application per 2.5 seconds, or 0.4 applications per second, at least for now. This is the base ICD for most characters, so it lines up pretty nicely. So let's get into the math. Oz, Fischl's skill, hits once every second, and if you use Fischl's burst properly, you can effectively have Oz on the field at all times. Kind of. Not really. It actually requires C6 to do this, and even then you'd end up with 1 second of downtime, though that's usually made up for in animation times, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say she can have Oz out permanently. Assuming a C4 Fischl, this means that Oz is doing exactly 188.7% damage per second. At max level, Fischl has 302.88 attack, including her base attack and her secondary stat attack bonus %. This means Oz deals 571.53 damage per second at the bare minimum. Nahida, at max level, has a base 298.97 attack and 115.2 elemental mastery. This means she will deal 393.34 damage per second. That sounds pretty bad. Nahida is only doing 68.82% of Fischl's damage. However, Nahida has no ICD, whilst Fischl's ICD is 5 seconds, or once every 4 hits. So going at our rate of 0.4 applications per second, Nahida also reacts 0.4 times per second, whilst Fischl only reacts 0.25 times per second, since Oz takes 4 shots to reapply an element, which takes 4 seconds. Since we use Quicken as the reaction type here, Nahida gains an additional 1,808.57 damage per elemental application, while Fischl gains only 1,663.88 damage per application because Aggravate, the electro derivation of Quicken, does less damage than Spread, the Dendro derivation, for whatever reason. On top of this, we need to include Nahida's elemental mastery bonus to that Spread damage since she has elemental mastery by default. To do so, we use this formula. Using this formula, we find that Nahida's spread damage is increased by 1.438 times. Still though, we have to factor in Fischl's passive 2, which deals 80% damage whenever an electro reaction occurs while Oz is on the field. That adds 96.92 DPS. However, that damage is electro damage, and it doesn't share an ICD with anything else, so we have to factor in an additional quicken reaction for every elemental application that occurs, which is again currently set to 1 every 2.5 seconds. This brings up their total DPS from just their off-field damage to 1,433.6 DPS for Nahida and 1,749.93 DPS for Fischl. Still pretty bad for Nahida, but it's not over yet, since this is functionally the slowest Nahida can go. We need to do this math over and over again while slowly increasing our X value from 1 application per 2.5 seconds all the way up to 1 application per 1.83 seconds, Nahida's fastest possible attack speed. Doing so nets us this graph. As we can see here, Nahida just barely doesn't catch up to Fischl's insane off-field damage. She falls short by nearly exactly 70.6 DPS. Granted, these values are insanely optimized for both off-field characters here. It's unlikely for you to ever hit Fischl's damage values here because it implies that Fischl's passive 2 is going off that consistently, but in reality that doesn't quite happen. This doesn't apply to Nahida though, because for whatever reason, both Aggravate and Spread are Dendro reactions, but Spread is not an electro reaction, which would cause Fischl's passive 2 to not proc in some cases. But that would go against the spirit of optimization, so I'm leaving that data in. And besides, I don't want to leave a conclusion that vague and airy. However, that's not the end of the story. Far from it. Because as I said way earlier, Nahida's skill can chain up to 8 different enemies. Except for Chamber 3 on floor 11, parts of floor 12, and the random Regisvine bosses on floor 8, you rarely see bosses in the Spiral Abyss. It's almost always more than one enemy. In this manner, Nahida's off-field DPS is doubled at the bare minimum, up to an 8-fold increase in damage, completely beating Fischl at its peak, assuming you're using AoE electrical attacks, which is very easy to do. Here's the graph assuming just 2 enemies that are close enough that you can reliably proc quicken on them. Even if you have C6 Fischl, Nahida still completely outscales her as seen on this graph. Her ability to hit more than one enemy, as opposed to Fischl who can only ever hit one enemy at a time, makes her far more powerful as long as there is at least 2 enemies. And this math was done without accounting for Bloom and its squared damage, which Nahida can easily proc since she can hit up to 8 enemies and apply Dendro to all of them. Though, I'm not sure you'd want to run a Bloom team because those have a habit of killing your own team. Essentially, if your team is constantly pumping out elements, say with a Catalyst character or an Infusion-based character, or even with just a team that does a lot of quick swapping, and you're fighting more than one enemy, Nahida will absolutely be one of, if not the best off-field DPS units in the game in terms of damage. Now, I don't want anyone to say, well, Zoob, you didn't factor in artifacts or weapons. Yeah, I didn't. Mostly because the RNG of artifacts makes stat optimizations extremely difficult to do, but also because weapons and artifacts grant either static bonuses or multiplicative bonuses based off of base stats. Nahida, as a 5-star character, already has a higher base attack than Fischl. This means every attack percent stat grants Nahida more attack per attack percent than it does for Fischl. In fact, once both Fischl and Nahida have an additional 6.6 attack percent, Nahida begins to outscale Fischl's total attack based on these equations. It literally only takes 2 attack percent substats in order for Nahida to have a higher total attack than Fischl, though Nahida doesn't primarily scale with attack. Crit rate and crit damage, however, would actually benefit Fischl more since she does more non-reaction based damage. On the other hand, Nahida scales primarily off Elemental Mastery, which multiplies elemental reaction damage in a completely separate manner from damage bonuses, but also because of her passive 2, she just gains extra damage and crit rate for having a lot of Elemental Mastery, not to mention that her passive 1 makes all reactions done by the active character much stronger as well. And even with all these concessions against Nahida, she is still doing more damage than Fischl. So, in conclusion, I'd say if you want a powerful off-field DPS unit or reaction driver, Nahida is absolutely worth it. I don't think you can go wrong with her. The calculations I did show that C0 Nahida is stronger than C4 Fischl and C6 Fischl, with the caveat that there be more than one enemy, and those calculations don't consider the buffs that Nahida gives to elemental reactions due to her passive 1, or the buffs that she gets to her skill from her passive 2, or that the math I did assumed that Oz can stay on the field permanently when he absolutely can't at C4, or technically at C6. Now, is it possible for your Fischl to be better than Nahida? Yes, absolutely. It probably wouldn't even be hard if you had a full-built Fischl in a very specific team, like a Raiden Electrocharge team. But a similar level of investment into Nahida would have equal, if not much better, returns. Honestly, to make Nahida even more powerful, pair her with Fischl. Fischl's passive 2 is really powerful with the catalyzed reactions, which include Quicken, Aggravate, and Spread, so having her with Nahida is going to make your team deal an absolutely insane amount of damage. And this would be the only way to almost guarantee a permanent Quicken aura on the enemies, which allows Fischl's passive 2 to actually be optimized if you're running an Electro main DPS. You'd effectively get to use both of these characters at their absolute peak. But that's about it for this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button. It's supposed to help. I don't know how, because I don't know how the algorithm works, but you might as well hit it and see if it has an effect. If you want to see more of my videos, make sure to subscribe because I post so very infrequently. You don't even have to worry about me spamming your feed because there's no way I make that many videos. I don't have nearly that amount of time. And as always, if you guys want to see my math, I have a Google Sheets available in the description below. But yeah, thanks for watching.